A racist judge forces a pregnant black woman to do push-ups in front of a packed courtroom, unaware that her husband is a powerful U.S. senator. What happens next will leave you stunned. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their authority so blatantly, or seen someone fight back against injustice in a way that changed everything? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Anna Carter shifted uncomfortably on the unforgiving wooden bench of the courthouse waiting area, her swollen feet a testament to the toll of carrying a child 7 months along. Despite the discomfort, her posture was unyielding, her gaze unwavering. Determination radiated from her as she scanned the room, taking in the muted conversations and the rustle of papers. She wasn't here for herself. She was here for Emily Brooks, her younger sister. Emily had been accused of petty theft, a charge she vehemently denied. "I didn't do it, Anna. I swear." Her words still echoed in Anna's mind from the night before, spoken with a mixture of desperation and defiance. Anna believed her. It wasn't blind loyalty. It was instinct, shaped by years of fighting for what was right. Anna had built her life on standing up against injustice. In their community, she was a beacon of support, a person who organized food drives, helped families avoid eviction, and hosted forums to hold officials accountable. When someone needed her, she showed up. Today was no different. The tension in the waiting area was palpable, a silent storm brewing. People glanced at Anna's rounded belly but quickly looked away, as if her presence challenged their perception of strength. As the minutes dragged on, a janitor entered the room, balancing a large box of legal files. The weight of the box tipped slightly, papers spilling out like a waterfall onto the floor. The sound broke the room's rhythm. A few people turned to look, but then quickly resumed their own business, pretending not to notice. The janitor, flustered, knelt to gather the papers, muttering apologies to no one in particular. Anna hesitated for only a moment. Then, placing a hand on the bench for support, she rose with deliberate effort. "Need a hand?" she asked, already bending down. "Oh no, ma'am. Please, I've got it," the janitor stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Anna ignored the protest, crouching slowly, the weight of her pregnancy making every movement deliberate. She reached for a stack of documents, carefully aligning their edges. "It's fine," she said gently. "We all need help sometimes." Her words carried more weight than she intended, and for a brief moment, the janitor paused, her eyes wide with gratitude. But not everyone was as moved by Anna's act of kindness. Behind a glass pane in his office, Judge Henry Hoffman stood watching, his sharp eyes narrowing. Known for his ruthless rulings and disdain for anything outside his rigid worldview, Hoffman exuded authority like a second skin. To him, Anna's actions weren't a sign of character. They were an anomaly. A pregnant woman helping someone else? It didn't fit his rigid sense of order. He tapped his finger against the glass, his lips tightening into a thin line. "What's she playing at?" he muttered to himself, irritation flickering in his gaze. Meanwhile, Anna rose carefully, handing the stack of papers back to the janitor. "There you go," she said, her voice steady but warm. The janitor mumbled her thanks, her face still flushed. Anna returned to her seat, her hands instinctively resting on her belly, as she exhaled slowly. The sound of creaking doors broke the silence, signaling the start of Emily's hearing. Anna straightened, her eyes darting to the entrance. Emily appeared, her face pale but resolute. Their eyes met, and Anna offered a small, reassuring nod. "You've got this," she mouthed. As the sisters locked eyes, Judge Hoffman emerged from his office and strode into the courtroom. His presence was immediate, commanding. The room hushed as he took his seat, his gaze sweeping over everyone before landing on Emily. "Emily Brooks," he announced, his voice cutting through the silence. "Another Brooks in my courtroom. What a surprise." The words dripped with condescension, and Anna's jaw tightened. She wanted to stand up and defend her sister, to call out the blatant prejudice in his tone, but she knew better. Hoffman's reputation preceded him. He was not a man to cross lightly. From his seat, Hoffman's eyes flicked briefly to Anna. Something about her demeanor, her quiet resolve, seemed to challenge him. He leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "You," he said suddenly, pointing a finger in her direction. Anna blinked, confused. "Me?" "Yes, you. Stand up," Hoffman demanded. Murmurs rippled through the room, confusion mingling with intrigue. Anna hesitated but rose slowly, her pregnant belly making the movement deliberate. Her heart thudded in her chest as she met his gaze. Hoffman's lip curled. "You seem to enjoy playing the Good Samaritan in my courthouse." he sneered. Let's see just how strong you really are. The room fell into a stunned silence, every eye fixed on Anna. Judge Hoffman's challenge hung in the air, heavy with implied menace. Anna stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her throat. Hoffman leaned back, his gaze cold. 50 push-ups. Right here, right now, or I'll hold you in contempt. Gasps erupted from the spectators. Emily's sharp intake of breath broke the stunned silence. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling with anger. Hoffman slammed his gavel. "One more word from you, Miss Brooks, and you'll find yourself in even more trouble," he barked. Anna's hands trembled as she placed them on the bench for support, her mind racing. The weight of the room's judgment bore down on her, but one thought rose above the noise. She couldn't let this man break her. As Anna prepared to respond, Hoffman's eyes glinted with satisfaction. He relished the control, the humiliation he was about to inflict. But Anna wasn't just carrying the weight of her unborn child. She carried years of fighting for what was right, of standing up when no one else would, and she wasn't about to stop now. Anna's small act of kindness had unwittingly ignited a confrontation with a man who thrived on dominance, setting the stage for a clash of wills that would shake the courthouse to its core. Emily Brooks stepped hesitantly into the courtroom, her shoulders squared but her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Her eyes darted to her sister, Anna, who sat on the courtroom bench, meeting Emily's gaze with calm determination. Anna offered a small, reassuring nod, her presence an unspoken promise that she wouldn't let Emily face this alone. Judge Henry Hoffman entered the room, his black robe flowing as he took his seat. The room fell into a tense silence as his piercing eyes scanned the faces before him. His gaze stopped at Emily, and his lips curled into a mocking smirk. "Emily Brooks," Hoffman began, his voice dripping with disdain. "Another Brooks in my courtroom. What is it about your family and the inability to stay out of trouble? It seems your name is becoming a permanent fixture here." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Emily flushed, her hands clenching into fists. On the bench, Anna felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, her jaw tightening at the blatant condescension. She wanted to leap to Emily's defense, but she knew Hoffman's reputation. He was a man who thrived on exerting control, and crossing him would only make things worse for her sister. Anna forced herself to remain calm, even as the tension in the room thickened. Hoffman's gaze flicked toward Anna, his expression sharpening. "You," he said abruptly, pointing directly at her. Anna blinked, startled. "Yes, Your Honor?" "Stand up," Hoffman ordered, his voice as cold as steel. Anna hesitated for a moment before rising slowly, the weight of her pregnancy making the movement deliberate. The room buzzed with murmurs as the spectators exchanged confused glances. "You seem to enjoy putting on a performance," Hoffman sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Helping janitors, playing the Good Samaritan. Let's see how much energy you really have." Anna frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm not sure I understand, Your Honor," she said cautiously. Hoffman leaned forward, his tone icy. 50 push-ups. Right here, right now. Show us how capable you really are." The room fell into stunned silence. Gasps erupted from the spectators, and Emily shot to her feet, her face pale with fury. "She's pregnant!" Emily shouted, her voice trembling with outrage. "You can't force her to—" "Sit down!" Hoffman bellowed, slamming his gavel onto the bench. The sharp crack echoed through the room, silencing Emily. "One more word from you, Miss Brooks, and I'll hold you in contempt. Is that clear?" Emily froze, her shoulders trembling with suppressed rage. Slowly, she sank back into her seat, glaring daggers at Hoffman. Anna's hands instinctively rested on her belly as she looked at Hoffman, her voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'm 7 months pregnant. I can't—" "Excuses," Hoffman interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "You will, or I'll hold you in contempt as well. Make your choice." The weight of his words pressed down on Anna like a physical force. Her body tensed, her heart pounding as she realized there was no way out. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered herself to the floor, her knees pressing against the cold tile. The room watched in horrified silence as Anna placed her hands on the floor, her belly making the position awkward and uncomfortable. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unease. Hoffman leaned back in his chair, a smug smirk tugging at his lips as he watched her prepare to comply. As Anna braced herself to endure the humiliation, the entire courtroom held its breath, waiting to see if she would break or rise above it. Anna braced herself on trembling hands, the cold tile beneath her palms a stark contrast to the heat radiating from her body. Each breath felt heavier than the last as she lowered herself for the first push-up. Her arms shook violently, and a sharp pain shot up her back. The baby shifted inside her, kicking against her ribs as if protesting the unnatural strain. The courtroom was eerily silent, save for her labored breathing and the faint creak of the wooden benches as spectators leaned forward to watch. "She's going to hurt herself," Jake Turner, the bailiff, muttered under his breath. He stepped forward, his expression tight with concern. "Your Honor, this is dangerous. She's 7 months pregnant." "You can't!" Hoffman's gavel slammed down with a sharp crack, cutting him off. "That's enough, Turner," he barked. "This is my courtroom, and I'll decide what's appropriate." "With respect, sir, this isn't appropriate," Turner started, but Hoffman's glare silenced him. "Another word, Turner, and you're out of a job," Hoffman snapped, his tone laced with menace. "Do I make myself clear?" Turner clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides, but he reluctantly stepped back. Across the room, Richard Hale, a clerk known for his sycophantic loyalty to Hoffman, chuckled under his breath. "She wanted to show off. Let her prove herself," he said, loud enough to draw glares from several spectators. Anna forced herself into a second push-up, her arms trembling so violently it took everything she had to push herself off the ground. Her vision blurred, black spots creeping into the edges of her sight as sweat dripped down her forehead. "Stop it!" Emily's voice rang out, sharp with desperation. She shot to her feet, her hands balled into fists. "You're going to kill her!" Hoffman's gavel slammed down again. "Sit down, Miss Brooks," he roared, his face twisted in anger. "One more word, and I'll double your sentence." "She's pregnant," Emily screamed, ignoring the threat. "You can't force her." "Enough!" Hoffman thundered. "Turner, remove her if she won't keep quiet." Turner hesitated, his eyes darting between Hoffman and Emily. The room buzzed with murmurs as spectators whispered in hushed tones, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. Anna collapsed onto the floor, her strength giving out. She lay there, her chest heaving, her hands clutching her belly protectively. In the back of the courtroom, Mark Davis, a young attorney with a reputation for taking on impossible cases, quietly angled his phone to capture the scene. His jaw tightened as he recorded Anna's struggle, his eyes narrowing with disgust at Hoffman's smug expression. Mark leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Mrs. Carter," he whispered, "you don't have to do this. I'm recording everything. We can take this to the oversight board." Anna turned her head slightly toward him, her face pale and glistening with sweat. Her voice was barely audible as she spoke. "It's not just about me," she said, her words strained but resolute. "It's about standing up to him." Mark's grip on his phone tightened, and he gave her a small nod. "Get up!" Hoffman barked, his voice cutting through the tension. "This courtroom isn't a place for theatrics. Either continue or admit you can't do it." Anna placed her hands back on the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. She gritted her teeth, trying to push herself up again, but her arms gave out, and she collapsed once more. Hoffman's smirk deepened, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Pathetic," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Emily, unable to contain herself, surged to her feet again. "You're the pathetic one," she shouted, her voice shaking with fury. "Abusing your power to humiliate a pregnant woman? You're disgusting!" "Turner!" Hoffman yelled, his face red with anger. "Get her out of here now!" Turner hesitated, looking between Hoffman and Emily again. But before he could act, Anna groaned, drawing everyone's attention back to her. The room fell silent as Anna tried to rise to her knees, her face contorted in pain. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as though she were carrying the weight of every injustice she had ever fought against. As Anna struggled against the physical and emotional weight pressing down on her, an unexpected presence shattered the oppressive atmosphere, turning the tide of the confrontation. The heavy doors of the courtroom burst open with a reverberating crash. Heads whipped around, and murmurs rippled through the spectators as a tall man strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. Robert Carter, a U.S. senator known for his unyielding stance on justice, scanned the room with a sharp, piercing gaze that landed squarely on his wife, crumpled on the floor. "Step aside," Robert ordered, his tone cold and firm, cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Two security officers moved swiftly to intercept him. "Sir, you can't," one began, his hand reaching out to block Robert's path. Robert didn't slow down. "Don't test me," he snapped, his voice rising in authority. The officer faltered, stepping back instinctively as Robert brushed past, his focus locked on Anna. As he knelt beside her, Anna's head tilted weakly toward him, her face pale and slick with sweat. "Robert," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," he said softly, his hand cradling her face for a brief moment. Then, his expression hardened. He rose to his full height, turning to face the bench. Hoffman's expression twisted in irritation, his authority visibly challenged. "This is a courtroom, Senator," he barked. "Not your campaign stage." Robert took a step forward, his presence filling the room. "And you call this justice, Judge?" he shot back, his voice steady but loaded with fury. "You force a pregnant woman, my wife, to humiliate herself on the floor in front of an audience? Who gave you that right?" Hoffman slammed his gavel onto the bench, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "This is my courtroom," he retorted, his voice rising with indignation. "I enforce the rules here." "Rules?" Robert's tone turned icy. "What rule allows you to endanger a woman's life to satisfy your ego? What law gives you the authority to degrade someone because you feel like it?" "This is contempt of court," Hoffman roared, his face flushed with anger. "If you don't leave this room immediately, I'll hold you in contempt." "Go ahead," Robert countered, his voice calm but cutting. "Hold me in contempt. But first, explain to this courtroom, and to the world, why you think this behavior is acceptable." The spectators murmured louder, the tension in the room growing unbearable. Even Hoffman's loyalists, like Clerk Richard Hale, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Hoffman leaned forward, his face a mask of rage. "Senator Carter, you are out of line." "No, Judge Hoffman," Robert said, his voice rising with conviction. "You're the one out of line. You've turned this courtroom into a stage for your own power trip, and I will not stand by while you put my wife and my child in danger." From the back of the room, Mark Davis rose from his seat, his phone still recording. "Your Honor," he said, his tone sharp, "everything you've done here today is on video. I'd think twice before making any further threats." Hoffman's eyes flicked toward Mark, his lips pressing into a thin line. For the first time, a glimmer of unease crossed his face. Robert seized the moment, taking another step toward the bench. "Your reign of intimidation ends here," he declared, his voice firm and unyielding. "You don't get to silence us. Not today." Emily, emboldened by Robert's presence, stood once more. "You've gone too far, Hoffman," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You can't keep getting away with this." "Turner!" Hoffman barked, snapping his head toward the bailiff. "Remove them all! Now!" Jake Turner hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. His gaze shifted between Hoffman, Robert, and Anna, who was still slumped on the floor. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but defiant. "I won't do it, sir." Hoffman's eyes widened in disbelief. "What did you just say?" "I said no," Turner repeated, his stance firm. "I won't be part of this." The courtroom buzzed with shock as Turner stepped back, signaling his refusal to obey. Hoffman's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his authority slipping further with every passing second. Robert turned to the spectators, his voice resonating through the room. "This is the moment we stand together," he said. "This man has abused his power for far too long, and it's time we hold him accountable." Applause broke out, hesitant at first but quickly growing louder as more people joined in. The sound swelled, filling the room and drowning out Hoffman's attempts to restore order. "Silence!" Hoffman bellowed, slamming his gavel repeatedly. But the gavel's sharp cracks were powerless against the wave of defiance surging through the courtroom. Robert knelt beside Anna once more, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Anna looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "You came," she whispered. "I'll always come," Robert replied firmly. Then, his gaze shifted back to Hoffman, his eyes burning with determination. "And I'm not leaving until this is over." Robert stood firm, his gaze locked on Hoffman, who clutched his gavel like a lifeline. The tension in the room was suffocating, every word crackling with the weight of authority and defiance. "You've crossed every ethical and legal boundary imaginable, Judge," Robert said, his voice ringing with conviction. He pulled out his phone, dialing with swift precision. "And now, the world is going to see it." Hoffman's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You dare undermine this court?" he snapped, his voice tinged with desperation. "I can have you removed. Better yet, I can hold you in contempt." Robert didn't flinch. "Go ahead," he said coolly. "Let's see how that plays out when your actions are on every news outlet by tonight." The line connected, and Robert's tone shifted, direct and authoritative. "This is Senator Carter. I need a press team at the courthouse immediately. And send legal counsel. I want this judge's actions documented and exposed." He ended the call, slipping the phone into his pocket with practiced ease. Hoffman banged his gavel, his face flushed with anger. "This is blatant interference, Senator. You have no jurisdiction here, no authority to—" "I have every right to protect my wife from your abuse," Robert cut in, his voice sharp. "You've humiliated her, endangered her, and now you're trying to cover it up with threats. You're done, Judge." The courtroom murmurs grew louder, whispers of agreement rippling through the spectators. Hoffman's eyes darted around the room, his once commanding presence beginning to waver. "Enough of this!" Hoffman shouted, slamming his gavel once more. "This is my courtroom. I will not be challenged in my own domain." "And yet here you are," Robert replied, stepping closer to the bench. "Challenged because your actions are indefensible. Because the people in this room can see exactly what you are. A man drunk on power, willing to destroy lives to feed his ego. You're out of line," Hoffman barked, his voice cracking slightly. "No, Judge," Robert said, his voice steady and deliberate. "You are." The doors to the courtroom opened again, this time more quietly but with an air of inevitability. A handful of reporters entered, their cameras and microphones at the ready. Mark Davis gestured them toward the front, his phone still recording. "Smile, Your Honor," Mark said dryly. "The press has arrived." Hoffman's face paled. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice tinged with panic. "It means you're not in control anymore," Robert said, turning to the reporters. "This judge has used his position to degrade and humiliate, not to uphold the law, but to wield it as a weapon. And today we're holding him accountable." Hoffman stood abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. "This is a farce. This court is not a stage for your theatrics, Senator." "No," Robert agreed, his voice calm but cutting. "But you've treated it as one for years, haven't you? Using that gavel to silence dissent, to punish rather than deliver justice. Well, your stage is being dismantled, piece by piece." The cameras focused on Hoffman, his face now a mixture of rage and discomfort. The murmurs in the room grew louder, the shift in power palpable. Even his loyal clerk, Richard Hale, looked uneasy, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "You think this will end well for you, Carter?" Hoffman sneered, his voice low but venomous. "Bringing reporters into my courtroom? Trying to turn this into a spectacle? It will backfire." "On the contrary," Robert said, his confidence unwavering. "The only thing backfiring here is your arrogance. People deserve to know the truth about the kind of man sitting on this bench." Mark stepped forward, addressing the reporters directly. "We have video evidence of Judge Hoffman's actions today, including his abuse of authority and endangerment of a pregnant woman. This footage will speak for itself." The reporters buzzed with interest, their cameras flashing as they captured every word. Hoffman's composure began to crack, his grip on his gavel tightening. "I'll have you all removed," Hoffman shouted, his voice rising with desperation. "Try it," Robert said, his tone steady. "Every action you take now only digs the hole deeper. So go ahead, Judge. Slam your gavel, shout your threats. But know that the entire country is watching." Hoffman's hand wavered, the gavel hovering above the bench as he glared at Robert. For the first time, he seemed truly unsure of what to do. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled into something louder, a ripple of defiance growing into a wave. Someone in the back of the room began to clap, and soon others joined in, the sound building into a collective statement of resistance. Hoffman's face flushed with humiliation. As the clapping grew louder, the courtroom no longer under his control. His once unshakable authority had crumbled, replaced by the glaring spotlight of accountability. Robert turned back to Anna, who was now sitting upright with the help of Jake Turner. Her exhaustion was evident, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. "You did this," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. "No," Robert replied, his voice soft. "We did this, together." As the reporters captured every moment, Hoffman's grip on power slipped further, leaving him to face the weight of his own actions in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The sharp click of camera shutters and the hum of recorders filled the courtroom as reporters swarmed in, their lenses trained on the chaos unfolding. Questions rang out in rapid succession, cutting through the murmurs of the stunned audience. "Senator Carter, can you comment on what's happening here?" "Judge Hoffman, do you deny the accusations of abuse of power?" "Mrs. Carter, are you okay? How do you feel about this ordeal?" Hoffman's face flushed crimson as the flood of cameras turned toward him, capturing every twitch of his tightening jaw and clenched fists. He slammed his gavel repeatedly, the sound desperate rather than authoritative. "Enough! This is a courtroom, not a press conference. Security, remove these reporters immediately." Several officers moved hesitantly, glancing toward Jake Turner, who stood frozen near Anna. Hoffman's glare snapped to Turner. "What are you waiting for? Confiscate their equipment and escort them out." Turner took a deep breath, his shoulders squaring. "With respect, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I can't do that. They have a right to be here." Hoffman's eyes flared with rage. "Are you defying a direct order from this court?" "I'm following the law," Turner replied. "They're not disrupting proceedings, and if you want me to break the law, you'll have to find someone else." The room erupted into a mixture of gasps and murmurs. Even the reporters momentarily paused, their cameras capturing Turner's defiance as much as the judge's increasingly unsteady demeanor. "You're out of line," Hoffman roared, pointing a trembling finger at Turner. "I'll have you suspended for this." "Do it," Turner shot back, his voice unwavering. "But it won't change the fact that you've lost control of this courtroom." Hoffman's gavel came down again, this time with less force. "Security!" he barked, looking to the other officers, but they shifted uncomfortably, their eyes avoiding his. Robert stepped forward, his voice rising above the din. "Judge Hoffman, you can try to silence the press, but the truth is already out. Every word, every action is being documented. What are you so afraid of?" "Afraid?" Hoffman spat, his voice trembling with fury. "I'm afraid of nothing, but I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus by opportunists like you." Robert smirked, his confidence unshaken. "A circus? No, Judge. What you're afraid of is accountability. You've used this courtroom as your personal fiefdom for far too long. Now the public gets to see the man behind the gavel." The reporters seized on the moment, turning their cameras back to Hoffman. His face contorted with frustration as he banged his gavel again. "Silence! I demand order." "You don't get to demand anything anymore," Mark Davis said, stepping into view with his phone still recording. "You've lost the room, Judge." Hoffman shot him a venomous glare. "Who the hell do you think you are?" "Someone who cares about justice," Mark replied evenly. "And today, justice means exposing your abuses for everyone to see." The judge's composure cracked further as the cameras zeroed in on him. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the gavel, but his threats had lost their weight. "You're all in contempt," Hoffman shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "I'll have every one of you held accountable for this chaos." "Enough with the empty threats," Robert said, stepping forward. "This isn't about contempt, it's about justice, and justice means transparency. You've hidden behind that bench for years, Hoffman, but there's no hiding now." The reporters pushed closer, their questions growing louder. Hoffman's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but even his most loyal ally, Richard Hale, looked uneasy. "You can't win this," Robert continued, his voice steady and resolute. "The people have the right to know what kind of man is sitting on that bench. The more you fight it, the worse it'll be for you." Hoffman clenched his fists, his gavel now lying forgotten on the bench. He looked at the reporters, their cameras capturing his every movement, and then at the audience, whose expressions ranged from outrage to satisfaction. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a growl. "You think this little show of yours will ruin me? I've been on this bench for over 2 decades. I've handled bigger men than you." "Then you should have learned by now," Robert said, his tone like steel. "The higher you climb on lies and intimidation, the harder you fall when the truth comes out." One of the reporters stepped closer, her microphone angled toward Hoffman. "Judge Hoffman, do you deny that you forced Mrs. Carter, a pregnant woman, to perform push-ups in your courtroom?" Hoffman opened his mouth to respond but faltered, his gaze darting to the cameras and then to the murmuring crowd. He was trapped, every word a potential weapon against him. Seeing his hesitation, Robert addressed the reporters. "The judge won't answer because there's no defense for his actions. But we have the evidence, on video, in eyewitness accounts, and now in your reports. Justice will prevail, not because of him, but in spite of him." The murmurs grew into applause, hesitant at first, but quickly gaining momentum. Hoffman sat back in his chair, his face pale, his authority reduced to ashes under the weight of public scrutiny. As the clapping subsided, a man in a rumpled shirt and tie cautiously approached Robert. His hesitant movements barely drew attention amidst the chaos of flashing cameras and murmurs. Keeping his voice low, he handed Robert a manila folder. "This," the man whispered, glancing nervously at Judge Hoffman, "has everything you need to prove he's been abusing his position for years. Names, dates, rulings. It's all in there." Robert studied the man's face, seeing both fear and determination. He took the folder, his grip firm. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The man swallowed hard. "Just someone who's tired of looking the other way." Without another word, he slipped back into the crowd. Robert opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. His expression darkened as he read, detailed accounts of biased rulings, unusually harsh sentences, and complaints buried by procedural delays filled the pages. Each one painted a damning picture of Hoffman's courtroom as a place where justice had long been overshadowed by personal vendettas. He raised the folder, addressing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've seen today isn't an isolated incident. This is part of a pattern, one that stretches back years. Judge Hoffman has repeatedly abused his power, and now we have proof." Hoffman's gavel came down hard, his voice booming. "This is nonsense. Baseless accusations meant to distract from the proceedings at hand." But Robert ignored him, stepping closer to the reporters. "Inside this folder are documents detailing cases where Hoffman's rulings were disproportionately harsh, where complaints about his conduct were silenced, and where justice was deliberately denied." A buzz of urgency rippled through the reporters as they adjusted their cameras and microphones, eager to catch every word. From the back of the room, a woman in her late 50s rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she steadied herself on the bench in front of her. Her voice was quiet at first, but grew stronger with each word. "He ruined my son's life." The room turned to face her, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "5 years ago, my son stood in this very courtroom. He was young, foolish, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But instead of a fair trial, Hoffman made an example of him. He gave him the maximum sentence for a first-time offense. My son was 19 years old. He's still in prison." The murmurs grew louder, disbelief and outrage spreading through the crowd. The woman's voice cracked, but she pressed on. "I filed complaints, begged for someone to review the case, but it went nowhere. I was told nothing could be done because judges have discretion. Well, his discretion destroyed my family." Hoffman's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "This is irrelevant," he barked. "I will not have my courtroom turned into a platform for baseless grievances." "It's not baseless," she shot back, her voice rising. "It's the truth, and you know it." The room erupted into applause again, a wave of solidarity sweeping through the spectators. Robert raised a hand, quieting the crowd. "This is just one story," he said, his voice steady but forceful. "How many more are out there? How many families have been torn apart because of Hoffman's unchecked power?" Mark Davis stepped forward, holding his phone high. "I've been recording everything today. Between this footage and what's in that folder, we have more than enough to bring this to the Judicial Oversight Committee." Hoffman slammed his gavel again, but it sounded weak, almost desperate. "This is slander," he shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. "You're all conspiring against me. None of this will hold up." Robert locked eyes with him, his expression cold. "It's not slander if it's the truth. And today, the truth is coming for you." Another voice rose from the crowd, this time a younger man. "I worked in this courthouse for 3 years," he said, his voice steady. "I saw how complaints about Judge Hoffman were buried. Staff were warned not to speak up, not to challenge him. Well, I'm done staying silent." Hoffman's face was ashen now, his composure crumbling as more voices joined in. One by one, people began to share their stories, small injustices, unreasonably harsh rulings, and intimidation tactics that all pointed to a pattern of abuse. The reporters captured it all, their pens flying across notepads and their cameras recording every word. Robert turned to Hoffman, his tone measured but cutting. "You've spent years silencing people, but today, they're speaking louder than you ever could. You can slam that gavel all you want. It won't drown them out anymore." Hoffman sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. He looked around the room, his gaze darting between the reporters, the spectators, and the damning folder in Robert's hand. For the first time, he seemed truly at a loss. The courtroom had become a stage for truth. And with each revelation, Hoffman's carefully constructed facade began to crumble, leaving him with nowhere to hide. The once commanding figure of Judge Henry Hoffman sat rigidly in his chair, his gavel now lying unused on the bench before him. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing every detail of his increasingly fraught expression. The room buzzed with an almost electric tension, reporters whispering and taking notes, every lens trained on the man who had ruled his courtroom with an iron fist for decades. Robert Carter stood at the center of the room, holding the damning folder high. "Judge Hoffman," he began, his voice carrying across the now silent courtroom, "it's time to answer for what you've done. You've used your position not to deliver justice, but to perpetuate your own power at the expense of others." Hoffman's fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair. He leaned forward, his face flushed with indignation. "This is nothing but a coordinated attack," he spat, his voice trembling. "I have served this court with distinction for over 20 years. If there were issues, blame the system, not me." Robert's eyes narrowed. The system didn't force a pregnant woman to do push-ups in front of a packed courtroom. The system didn't bury complaints or hand down excessively harsh sentences. Those were your choices, Judge. The murmurs of agreement from the audience grew louder. Hoffman glanced around the room, his composure slipping further. "You're twisting the narrative," he said, his tone desperate. "These people, these accusations, they're being weaponized against me because I've always enforced the law without compromise." Mark Davis stepped forward, his phone still recording. "Without compromise?" he asked sharply. "No, Judge Hoffman. You enforced your ego, not the law. That folder is full of evidence that proves it." Hoffman pointed a shaking finger at Mark. "You're a nobody," he snarled. "A meddling attorney who doesn't understand what it takes to run a courtroom." Mark didn't flinch. "What it takes is integrity. Something you seem to have forgotten." The tension thickened as another voice rose from the back of the room. It was the older woman who had earlier shared her son's story. "My family trusted this system," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We believed in the fairness of the law. You took that away from us, Hoffman. And you can't blame anyone but yourself." Applause broke out again, this time louder and more unified. The reporters swiveled their cameras toward the woman, capturing her defiance as she stood tall despite the weight of her grief. Hoffman pounded his fist on the bench, his face a mask of frustration. "This is chaos!" he shouted. "You're all being manipulated by this man and his theatrics." Robert took a step closer to the bench, his gaze unrelenting. "The only one manipulating anyone here is you, Hoffman. But your time is up. The truth is out, and there's no escaping it now." Hoffman opened his mouth to retort, but another interruption came, not from the crowd, but from the back doors of the courtroom. Two officials in suits entered, their presence drawing immediate attention. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, addressed Hoffman directly. "Judge Hoffman," he said, his voice clear and formal, "we've been sent by the Judicial Oversight Committee. Based on the evidence presented today and prior complaints, you are hereby placed under investigation." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Hoffman's face drained of color. "Investigation?" he repeated, his voice a strained whisper. "This is a misunderstanding. I've done nothing wrong." The official raised a hand, cutting him off. "Your rulings, conduct, and the suppression of complaints will be reviewed in detail. Effective immediately, you are suspended from presiding over any cases until this investigation concludes." Hoffman stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't do this," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls. "I am this courtroom. This is my domain." The official remained unmoved. "Not anymore, Judge." The reporters surged forward, their cameras capturing every angle of Hoffman's unraveling. The man who had once ruled the courtroom with unshakable confidence now stood alone, his authority stripped away in front of everyone. Desperate, Hoffman turned to Robert. "You think this makes you a hero, Senator?" he hissed. "You think tearing me down changes anything? The system will keep grinding people down, with or without me." Robert's expression was calm, but his words carried weight. "Maybe the system is broken," he admitted. But today, we've taken the first step toward fixing it by holding people like you accountable." The audience erupted into applause once more, the sound filling the courtroom. Hoffman's shoulders sagged as the weight of the moment finally seemed to crush him. The officials escorted Hoffman out of the room, his head held high at first, but as the cameras followed his every step, his confidence gave way. By the time he reached the doors, he looked like a man defeated. Robert turned to the crowd, his voice rising above the din. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The fight for justice doesn't end with one man's downfall. It's a fight we must carry forward together." The audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Anna, now seated and supported by Jake Turner, managed a small smile. The tide had turned, and for the first time in what felt like hours, hope filled the room. The courtroom was still buzzing with residual tension as Judge Hoffman was escorted out, but the trial resumed under the temporary supervision of a senior clerk. Despite the chaos that had unfolded, the proceedings for Emily's case pushed forward, now under the unflinching scrutiny of reporters and onlookers. Robert returned to Anna's side, ensuring she was comfortable, before shifting his focus back to Emily, who sat stiffly at the defendant's table. Though her posture was rigid, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The clerk cleared his throat, bringing the room to order. "The case of Emily Brooks will continue," he announced, his voice steady but nervous under the watchful eyes of the press. The prosecutor rose, his confidence visibly shaken after Hoffman's downfall. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the clerk now presiding, "the state maintains its position that Ms. Brooks is guilty of theft, based on the evidence presented earlier." Robert interrupted, standing firmly. "Evidence that is circumstantial at best," he said, his voice calm yet commanding, "and conveniently lacking key context." The prosecutor frowned. "The surveillance footage only shows my client in the vicinity of the alleged theft," Mark Davis interjected, stepping forward as Emily's attorney. He held up a document. "But here's something it doesn't show. This is a sworn affidavit from a store employee stating they witnessed another individual committing the theft, while Ms. Brooks was nearby. That individual has since been apprehended, and they have confessed." The courtroom murmured, the sound growing louder as the prosecutor flipped through the papers handed to him by Mark. His face tightened, and he quickly turned to his table, whispering furiously with his co-counsel. Mark pressed on. "Furthermore, cell phone location data confirms that my client left the store mere moments after the incident occurred, with no stolen items in her possession. This data, coupled with the confession from the actual perpetrator, proves her innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt." The prosecutor looked back at the clerk, his confidence visibly diminished. "The state has no further objections." The clerk nodded. "In light of this new evidence, it is clear that Ms. Brooks was wrongfully accused." He turned to Emily, his expression softening. "Ms. Brooks, the charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are free to go." A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom, followed by a smattering of applause. Emily sat frozen for a moment, disbelief etched across her face. Then, as the reality of the moment sank in, tears welled in her eyes. She turned to Anna and Robert, her voice shaking. "I don't even know what to say. Thank you, both of you. You didn't just save me from this nightmare. You saved me from losing faith in everything." Anna, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten, reached out and took Emily's hand. "You're my sister," she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "There was never a question. We fight for each other." Emily nodded, her lips trembling. She turned to Robert. "You didn't have to step in, but you did. I'll never forget that." Robert smiled faintly, his voice low but firm. "Justice isn't just a word, Emily. It's something we fight for. And today, we won. For you, and for everyone who's ever been silenced." As the courtroom began to empty, Emily was swarmed by reporters eager for her reaction. She answered their questions with newfound confidence, her voice unwavering as she recounted the injustice she'd faced and the people who had stood by her. Robert helped Anna to her feet, his arm steadying her as they made their way toward the exit. Emily caught up to them, slipping her arm around Anna's shoulders. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Emily said softly, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. Anna smiled weakly, leaning into her sister. You would have done the same for me. Robert glanced back at the courtroom one last time, his expression thoughtful. We've won today, he said, his tone firm. But this fight isn't over. There are more people out there stuck in the same broken system that almost swallowed Emily. We can't stop here. The fallout from the courtroom drama was immediate. Videos of Judge Hoffman's humiliation and the revelations of his misconduct spread like wildfire across news networks and social media. But Robert and Anna Carter knew that exposing one corrupt judge was only the beginning. Within days, Robert held a press conference on the courthouse steps, flanked by Anna, Emily, and a growing coalition of activists. Microphones crowded the podium as reporters shouted questions. But Robert raised his hand, silencing the clamor. This isn't just about one judge or one courtroom, Robert said, his voice ringing with conviction. It's about a broken system that allows abuses of power to go unchecked. Today, we call on every community to join us in demanding accountability and transparency in our judicial system. The statement was more than a rallying cry. It was a declaration of war against systemic injustice. The first protest took place a week later, starting outside the very courthouse where Hoffman's reign had crumbled. What began as a small gathering quickly swelled into a massive crowd as people from all walks of life joined in. Signs demanding justice for all and end judicial corruption waved in the air. Robert addressed the crowd from a makeshift stage, his voice amplified by speakers. For too long, the scales of justice have been tipped in favor of the powerful, he said. Today, we're here to rebalance those scales, to ensure fairness for everyone, not just the privileged few. Anna took the microphone next, her presence commanding despite her obvious fatigue. As a mother-to-be, I want my child to grow up in a world where the law is a shield, not a weapon, she said. But that change starts with us. It starts here, today. The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy palpable. Recognizing that public awareness was key, Robert and Anna began organizing community forums across the state. At each event, they shared their story, using it as a lens to examine broader issues of judicial misconduct and systemic failure. One night, in a packed high school gym, a young woman stood up during the QA session. I was afraid to speak out when my brother was wrongfully convicted, she said, her voice trembling. But hearing your story gives me hope. What can I do to help? Anna stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. You've already taken the first step by speaking out. Now, we need voices like yours to keep the pressure on. Tell your story, join the movement, and demand change. The young woman nodded, tears streaming down her face as the crowd erupted into applause. While Anna and Robert mobilized the public, a team of legal experts and activists worked behind the scenes to draft legislation aimed at curbing judicial overreach. The proposed reforms included mandatory reviews of judicial conduct, increased transparency in sentencing, and protections for whistleblowers who exposed corruption. At a legislative hearing, Robert testified before a panel of lawmakers, his tone measured but resolute. This isn't about punishing judges. It's about restoring faith in our justice system, he said. Without accountability, there can be no trust. And without trust, the very foundation of our democracy is at risk. The committee room was silent as Robert concluded his remarks, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Momentum continued to build as more people came forward with their stories of judicial misconduct. A documentary team began filming the Carters' journey, using their fight as a focal point to examine systemic issues nationwide. Social media became a powerful tool for the movement. Hashtags like SAR Justice for All and Tarjar Fix the System trended for weeks, amplifying voices that had long been silenced. Videos of protests, community forums, and personal testimonies flooded timelines, each one a rallying cry for change. One particularly moving clip featured Anna, visibly pregnant, addressing a crowd of thousands. When I was forced to the floor in that courtroom, I wasn't just carrying my child. I was carrying the weight of every injustice I'd ever witnessed, she said. But I rose, and together, we will rise. Not everyone welcomed the Carters' efforts. Certain judges and legal associations accused them of undermining the judiciary's independence. Editorials criticizing the movement appeared in conservative outlets, labeling it as anti-law and order. At a press conference, A reporter challenged Robert. Senator Carter, how do you respond to accusations that your movement is eroding public trust in the judiciary? Robert didn't hesitate. Public trust in the judiciary is already eroded. That's why we're here. If shining a light on misconduct undermines trust, then maybe that trust wasn't earned in the first place. The statement went viral, solidifying the Carters' position as uncompromising advocates for reform. Robert and Anna Carter sat at the center of a conference table surrounded by activists, legal experts, and community leaders. The air was thick with urgency as papers shuffled, laptops hummed, and voices debated the final details of proposed legislation. This bill must include mandatory oversight of judicial conduct, Robert said firmly, tapping the table to emphasize his point. We can't leave it to self-regulation. That's how this corruption festers. A young attorney nodded. We've drafted provisions requiring independent review boards for misconduct cases. Judges will no longer be able to bury complaints in bureaucratic red tape. Good, Anna said, her voice steady. But it's not enough. We need whistleblower protections too. No one should fear retaliation for speaking out against abuse. The room murmured in agreement. These were the building blocks of a transformative bill aimed at restoring accountability to the judicial system. Weeks later, Robert and Anna stood on the steps of the state capitol, flanked by activists holding signs demanding reform. Their voices echoed across the square as they called on lawmakers to pass the Judicial Accountability and Integrity Act. We're here today because the system failed, Robert declared, his tone resolute. It failed my wife, it failed my sister-in-law, and it's failing countless others every day. This bill is our chance to ensure that no one else suffers the same injustice. Inside the Capitol, the Carters faced a mix of support and resistance. Lawmakers aligned with entrenched interests pushed back hard, labeling the proposed reforms as anti-judiciary and an overreach into judicial independence. During a heated committee meeting, a senior legislator confronted Robert. Senator Carter, he said, his tone sharp, this bill undermines the very foundation of our legal system. Judges need autonomy to perform their duties without fear of retribution. Robert didn't flinch. Autonomy is not a license for abuse, he shot back. This bill doesn't undermine the judiciary. It strengthens it by ensuring it operates with integrity. Transparency isn't a threat to justice. It's a cornerstone of it. Anna added, her voice unwavering. Accountability and independence aren't mutually exclusive. A system that protects misconduct isn't independent. It's broken. Their arguments carried weight, but the opposition was fierce. Lobbyists for judicial associations flooded the Capitol, attempting to sway undecided legislators. Outside the legislative chambers, public support for the bill grew louder. Protests swelled in size, with thousands gathering in major cities to demand reform. Social media campaigns flooded timelines with personal stories of judicial abuse, each one amplifying the urgency of the Carters' mission. One particularly powerful story came from a former court clerk who spoke anonymously. Her testimony revealed how complaints against judges were routinely dismissed or ignored. I was told to shred documents and keep my mouth shut, she said in a viral video. This bill would have protected me and the people those judges hurt. Robert shared the video during a legislative session, his voice tinged with both anger and determination. How many more voices like hers are we going to silence? This bill isn't just about preventing abuse. It's about empowering the people who make this system work to speak out without fear. The pressure began to shift the tide. Lawmakers who had initially opposed the bill started signaling their support, realizing that the public demand for change was too strong to ignore. As the bill neared its final vote, the Carters launched a last-ditch effort to secure its passage. Robert spent hours in one-on-one meetings with legislators, while Anna focused on mobilizing grassroots support. During a town hall meeting packed with constituents, Anna addressed the crowd. We can't let this moment slip away, she said. Change doesn't happen by waiting for someone else to act. It happens when we refuse to back down. Together, we can build a system that truly serves justice. Her words resonated deeply, sparking renewed energy in the movement. Calls and emails flooded legislators' offices, leaving no doubt about where the public stood. On the day of the vote, the legislative chamber was packed. Reporters lined the walls, and activists filled the public gallery. The tension was palpable as lawmakers cast their votes. When the final tally was announced, cheers erupted. The Judicial Accountability and Integrity Act had passed with a decisive majority. Anna leaned into Robert, her hand gripping his tightly. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No," Robert replied, his tone soft but firm. "We all did it." The celebration spilled onto the steps of the Capitol, where supporters cheered and embraced. Cameras captured the moment as Robert and Anna stood before the crowd, their faces a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "This isn't the end," Robert said, addressing the sea of supporters. "It's the beginning of a better future, a future where justice truly means something." The air was alive with energy as thousands gathered in the city square, the crowd spilling into surrounding streets. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "Reform is here to stay" waved high above the crowd. At the center of it all, a small stage had been erected, draped with banners bearing the movement's slogans. Robert Carter stood at the podium, flanked by Anna and their newborn daughter. The baby rested in Anna's arms, her tiny presence a symbol of hope and the future they were fighting to protect. Robert adjusted the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "When we began this journey, we were just one family standing up to a broken system," he began, his voice steady and firm. "But today, we are so much more than that. We are a movement, a force for change that cannot be silenced." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound echoing through the city streets. Anna stepped forward, her voice soft but carrying strength. "There was a moment when I felt powerless," she said. "When I was on that courtroom floor, humiliated and struggling, I thought the fight was over, but I was wrong. Because in that moment, I realized something. Justice isn't handed to us. It's something we have to fight for, together." Her words hung in the air, and the crowd grew silent, captivated by her resolve. Robert took her hand, his expression one of pride and determination. "We've proven that justice isn't a luxury reserved for the powerful," he continued. "It's a right, one that belongs to every single person standing here today." And while this movement began in a courtroom, it doesn't end there. As Robert's words echoed across the square, a large screen behind the stage began playing clips from the movement's journey. Images of protests, community forums, and legislative victories flashed in succession, each one a testament to what they had accomplished together. The most striking moment was a still frame of Anna standing in the courtroom, defying Judge Hoffman even as she faced humiliation. It served as a stark reminder of how far they had come, and how much further there was to go. A young boy in the crowd turned to his father. "Can we really change things like they did?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. The father nodded, his gaze fixed on the stage. "If they can, so can we," he said simply. Back on stage, Anna addressed the crowd once more. "This isn't just about our family," she said, her voice clear. "It's about every family who has faced injustice and every person who has felt powerless. We didn't win this fight alone, and we can't win the next one alone either. It's up to all of us to keep pushing forward." Her words ignited another wave of applause, but the message was clear. The responsibility didn't end with them. Robert gestured to the baby cradled in Anna's arms. "This is our daughter, Grace," he said, his voice softening. "She's why we fight. For her, and for every child who deserves to grow up in a world where justice isn't a privilege, but a promise." The crowd roared its approval, the sound swelling like a tide. As the rally concluded, people lingered, sharing stories and connecting with one another. Volunteers handed out flyers for upcoming initiatives, while community leaders strategized about the next steps. The energy in the air was undeniable. This was no longer just a movement, it was a revolution. Robert and Anna stepped off the stage, making their way through the throng of supporters. People stopped them to shake hands, offer thanks, and share how the movement had changed their lives. "You gave us hope," one woman said, tears streaming down her face. "For the first time, I believe things can actually get better." Robert smiled, his voice warm. "Hope is just the beginning. Now we turn it into action." As the sun began to set, casting the square in golden light, Robert and Anna stood on the steps of the stage, gazing out at the crowd. Their daughter stirred in Anna's arms, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. Robert raised a hand, signaling for one final message. The crowd quieted instantly, their attention fixed on him. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice resonating with strength and conviction. "And there's still a long road ahead. But if today has proven anything, it's that together we are unstoppable. Together, we've shown that justice is not a luxury, it's a right, and we will never stop fighting for it." Anna added, her voice filled with quiet determination. "For us, for our children, and for every generation to come, this is only the beginning. Together we will rise." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, their voices blending into a single, unified roar. Robert and Anna exchanged a glance, their shared determination shining brightly. As they turned to leave, their daughter nestled securely between them. It was clear that the story of their fight was far from over, but they had sparked something greater than themselves, a movement that would continue to grow, fueled by the belief that justice belongs to everyone. The story of Anna and Robert Carter is more than just a fight for justice. It's a testament to the power of standing together against injustice. They proved that even in the face of a broken system, courage and collective action can spark meaningful change. But this journey doesn't end here. It's a reminder that each of us has a role to play in building a fairer, more just world. What would you do if faced with a moment where you could make a difference? Would you stand up, speak out, and fight for what's right? If this story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join the conversation. Together, we can amplify these voices, spread awareness, and make sure stories like this reach everyone who needs to hear them. Thank you for watching. And remember, the fight for justice belongs to all of us. See you in the next video.
The rain poured heavily, drenching the cracked asphalt of a quiet street in one of the city's most overlooked neighborhoods. Grace Johnson pulled the hood of her jacket tighter over her head, the water dripping from its edge as she glanced around the dimly lit street. She had parked her car farther than usual after attending a tense community meeting, where frustrations had boiled over into shouting matches between residents and police representatives. It was nothing new to Grace. Her job as the newly appointed chief of police demanded that she stand as a buffer between two sides of a fractured system. Her shoes splashed against shallow puddles as she walked briskly, her mind replaying snippets of the meeting. "We're tired of promises," one man had shouted. "Every time y'all come here, it's the same speech. Where are the results?" Grace had listened calmly, nodding as her stomach twisted. She'd made it her mission to show these communities that change was possible, but the weight of systemic failures and the skepticism of those she aimed to serve pressed down on her like a boulder. It wasn't until she heard the sharp screech of tires behind her that her train of thought was interrupted. A police cruiser slowed to a crawl a few yards away, its headlights piercing through the rain. Grace's posture stiffened instinctively, though she didn't stop walking. The cruiser rolled closer, its engine humming as the passenger side window slid down. "Hey!" barked a voice from the car, loud and commanding. "What are you doing out here?" Grace turned her head slightly, her lips parting to answer, but she was immediately cut off. "This is a high-crime area," the officer continued. "You're looking real suspicious. Stop right there." Grace exhaled sharply, her irritation flaring. "I'm walking to my car," she replied, keeping her tone neutral but firm. She was no stranger to interactions like these. She'd faced them all her life, even as a rising star in law enforcement. But tonight, she wasn't wearing her uniform or badge. To these officers, she was just another black woman on the street. The cruiser came to a halt, and two officers stepped out. Both were tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded the confidence of men who rarely had their authority questioned. The taller one, whose name tag read Reed, adjusted his belt as he approached. His partner, Miller, flanked him, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as if preparing for trouble. "You got ID on you?" Reed demanded, his tone curt. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "I do," she said, reaching into her pocket. But before she could produce her wallet, Miller's voice cut through. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he snapped, his hand tightening on his weapon. Grace froze, her pulse spiking. "I'm reaching for my ID," she said evenly, though her voice carried a sharp edge. "There's no need for this. Lady, I said keep your hands where I can see them." Miller barked again, stepping closer. The tension in the air was palpable, the rain now mixing with the perspiration forming on Grace's brow. "I'm a police officer," Grace said firmly, meeting their eyes. You're making a mistake. Reed scoffed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Oh, you're a cop, huh? You got a badge to prove that, or are you just saying it to get out of trouble? I'm not getting out of anything, Grace shot back, her voice rising slightly. I'm the chief of... Before she could finish, Reed interrupted with a mocking laugh. Chief? Yeah, right. And I'm the damn mayor. Miller chuckled, shaking his head. You got some nerve, he muttered. How about we skip the stories and get down to business? You're loitering in a known drug zone, and we don't have time for games. Grace's jaw tightened as she felt a swell of anger rise in her chest. I'm not loitering, she said through gritted teeth. I just left a meeting, and my car is parked a block away. If you let me... Turn around and put your hands on your head, Reed ordered, cutting her off. The smirk was gone now, replaced by a cold, hardened expression. He stepped closer, the rain soaking through his uniform as he glared at her. Grace's heart pounded. Are you seriously arresting me? She demanded, incredulous. I haven't done anything wrong. Stop resisting, Miller barked, his voice rising as he closed the distance between them. Do what you're told, or we'll do it for you. I'm not resisting, Grace exclaimed, throwing her hands up in frustration. This is ridiculous. If you'd just... But before she could finish, Reed grabbed her arm, yanking it behind her back. The sudden force sent a sharp pain shooting up her shoulder. Grace gasped, struggling to maintain her composure as the situation spiraled out of control. Stop resisting, Reed shouted again, twisting her arm further. Grace stumbled, her knees hitting the wet pavement as Miller moved to restrain her other arm. This is assault, she yelled, her voice cracking with a mixture of pain and fury. I'm telling you, you're making a huge mistake. Yeah, Reed muttered, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Save it for the judge. The sound of her cuffs clicking into place seemed to echo in her ears, louder than the rain pounding the ground around them. Humiliation burned in her chest as she felt the weight of their hands on her, pinning her to the ground like a common criminal. Her mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. How had it escalated to this? How could they not see her for who she was? As she knelt there, her cheek pressed against the cold pavement, a crowd began to gather. Residents peered out from their windows and porches, murmuring among themselves as they pulled out their phones to record the unfolding scene. The officers seemed oblivious, or indifferent, to the attention they were attracting. You're gonna regret this, Grace said, her voice low but steady. I promise you. Reed crouched down beside her, his face inches from hers. The only thing I regret, he sneered, is having to deal with mouthy people like you. Grace's blood boiled at his words, but she forced herself to remain calm. Check my ID, she said through clenched teeth. It's in my pocket. Just check it. Reed hesitated, glancing at Miller, who shrugged. Fine, Reed muttered, shoving his hand into her jacket pocket. He pulled out her wallet and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the contents. The moment he saw the badge, his expression froze. His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure shock. What the... he muttered, blinking as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. What is it? Miller asked, stepping closer. Reed wordlessly held up the wallet, the shiny badge glinting in the rain. Miller's face went pale as he read the name and title printed on the ID. Chief of Police, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. His eyes darted to Grace, who was now sitting up, her cuffs still digging into her wrists. That's right, Grace said coldly, her eyes locking onto theirs. I'm your boss. The two officers exchanged panicked glances, their bravado crumbling before her eyes. The crowd around them had grown, their phones capturing every second of the unfolding drama. The once commanding presence of Reed and Miller now seemed small, insignificant. Uncuff me, Grace ordered, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Reed fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling as he unlocked the cuffs. Grace rubbed her wrists, her eyes never leaving the two men who had just humiliated her in front of an entire neighborhood. You two have a lot to answer for, she said, her voice low and deadly serious. And trust me, you will answer for it. The weight of her words hung in the air as the rain continued to fall. The crowd began to cheer, their voices ringing out in defiance of the officers who now stood frozen in place, their faces pale with fear. Grace stood tall, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, but her dignity fully intact. This was far from over. The police station was quiet, but the air was thick with tension. Grace Johnson sat at the head of a long conference table, her freshly printed incident report sitting untouched in front of her. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the officers gathered there. Many of them wouldn't meet her gaze, their discomfort evident. Reed and Miller sat at the far end, their faces pale and tense, sweat beading on their foreheads. The weight of what they had done hung over them like a storm cloud, and the quiet murmurs of their colleagues only added to their shame. Grace tapped her fingers on the table, the sound breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Let me be very clear," she began, her voice steady but sharp. "What happened last night was unacceptable. Not just for me, but for the department, for the community, and for every officer who puts on this uniform with integrity." Her words were met with silence. No one dared to speak, and the tension in the room deepened. Grace leaned forward, her gaze laser-focused on Reed and Miller. "Do you have anything to say for yourselves?" Reed cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Chief, it was a misunderstanding," he stammered. "We didn't know it was you." Grace's lips curled into a bitter smile. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me get this straight. You saw a black woman walking to her car, assumed she was a criminal, and escalated the situation to the point where I was handcuffed and pinned to the ground. That's not a misunderstanding, Officer Reed. That's profiling. That's abuse of power. And let me remind you," her voice hardened, "that I am not the first victim of your actions. I just happened to be the one you couldn't sweep under the rug." Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Chief, Don't," Grace interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't even try to defend it. I've already reviewed your records." She reached for a file sitting beside her, flipping it open. "Officer Reed, you've been the subject of 3 separate complaints in the last 2 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, and verbal abuse. All dismissed due to lack of evidence. Convenient, isn't it?" She slammed the file shut and turned her gaze to Miller. "And you, Officer Miller, your record isn't much better. 2 complaints for misconduct, both buried by procedural loopholes. I want to know, do either of you think this behavior is acceptable?" Neither man answered. Reed looked down at the table, and Miller clenched his jaw, his fists tightening in his lap. Grace's frustration boiled over. "Answer me," she demanded, her voice ringing out like a gunshot. "Do you think this is acceptable?" "No, ma'am," Reed muttered finally, his voice barely audible. "I didn't hear you," Grace said, her tone cutting. "Speak up." "No, ma'am," Reed repeated, louder this time. Miller nodded, his voice following. "No, ma'am." Grace leaned back in her chair, her piercing gaze never leaving them. "Good. Because let me tell you what's going to happen next. An independent investigation has already been launched into last night's incident. I've requested body cam footage, radio logs, and statements from the officers involved. And you can bet that every single piece of evidence will be scrutinized. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, ma'am," they both replied in unison, their voices trembling slightly. Grace's anger simmered beneath the surface as she addressed the rest of the room. "To everyone sitting here, this is the culture that stops today. We cannot protect and serve a community if we treat its members as enemies. The people out there," she pointed toward the window overlooking the city, "deserve better from us. And I won't allow this department to perpetuate the kind of systemic failures that have eroded their trust." One of the older officers, Lieutenant Harris, cleared his throat and spoke up cautiously. "Chief, if I may, there are good officers here who are doing their jobs the right way. Not everyone shares the same biases." Grace turned her attention to him, her expression softening slightly. "I know that, Harris," she said. "But silence is complicity. If you see misconduct and don't report it, you're part of the problem. We can't allow the actions of a few to tarnish the reputation of the many. That's why this department is going to change, starting now." The room fell silent again as Grace stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "Reed, Miller," she said, her voice firm. "You're both suspended, effective immediately. Pending the results of the investigation, further action will be taken, including possible termination. Gather your things and leave your badges at the desk on your way out." Reed's mouth opened as if to protest, but the look in Grace's eyes silenced him. He nodded stiffly, rising from his chair. Miller followed, his face red with humiliation. The two men shuffled out of the room, the sound of their boots echoing in the silence. As the door closed behind them, Grace took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "This is not the end of this conversation," she said, her voice softer but no less resolute. "We have a lot of work to do, and it's not going to be easy. But if you're not willing to be part of the solution, you don't belong here. That's the reality." She straightened, glancing around the room once more. Dismissed. The officers filed out slowly, murmuring among themselves. Some avoided Grace's gaze, while others gave her small nods of acknowledgement. As the room emptied, Harris lingered, stepping closer to her. "Chief," he said quietly, "that was intense, but necessary." Grace gave him a small, tired smile. "Intense doesn't even begin to cover it, Harris. But thank you." He hesitated before speaking again. "You know they're going to fight this, right? The union, the press. There's going to be backlash." Grace sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know. But if I back down now, what's the point of any of this? They need to see that we're serious. That I'm serious." Harris nodded, his respect for her evident in his eyes. "If anyone can do it, it's you." Grace watched him leave, the weight of the night pressing down on her shoulders. Alone in the room, she finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving her exhausted but resolute. She walked over to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked city below. The community deserved better. They deserved more than apologies and empty promises. And no matter how hard the fight, Grace was determined to deliver. As she stood there, her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up and saw a text from an unknown number. "You're making enemies. Be careful." Grace's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the screen. A cold realization settled over her. This wasn't just about fixing the department. It was about survival, hers, and that of everyone willing to stand with her. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the overcast sky, casting a dull, gray hue over the city. Grace sat at her desk, staring at the open folder in front of her. It was stuffed with papers, complaints, incident reports, internal memos. Most of it revolved around Reed and Miller, but as she dug deeper, it became clear this wasn't an isolated incident. What lay before her was evidence of something far bigger, a culture of complacency and corruption that had taken root in the department long before she became chief of police. Her door swung open, and Lieutenant Harris stepped in, closing it behind him. "Chief," he began, his voice low, "we've got a problem." Grace looked up, exhaustion etched on her face. "What now?" Harris handed her a tablet. "This just hit the local news," he said. On the screen was a grainy security camera video, captured from a corner store near the scene of her altercation with Reed and Miller. It showed the two officers manhandling her, pinning her to the ground as a small crowd gathered. The headline read, "Police Chief Assaulted by Her Own Officers, a Systemic Problem Exposed." Grace exhaled sharply, setting the tablet down. "Well," she muttered, "at least the truth is out." Harris shifted uncomfortably. "That's not all," he said. "The union's already spinning this. They're calling it a miscommunication, and saying you escalated the situation by not identifying yourself sooner." Grace's eyes narrowed. "A miscommunication," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "I was assaulted, Harris. There's nothing to spin about that." "I know," Harris said quickly. "But they're trying to protect their own. They're claiming this was just a mistake, and that suspending Reed and Miller was an overreaction." Grace clenched her jaw. "Of course they are." She stood, pacing the room. "This isn't just about Reed and Miller anymore. This is about the entire culture they represent. And if the union wants to fight me on this, then so be it. I'm not backing down." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "There's something else," he added. "I ran those background checks you asked for, on Reed and Miller. And you're not going to like what I found." Grace stopped pacing, turning to him. "What is it?" Harris hesitated, then handed her another file. "Reed has been receiving payments, large ones, deposited into an account in his wife's name. And they're coming from a business tied to a known gang in the city. Grace's stomach dropped as she flipped through the file, her mind racing. Are you telling me Reed is working with the gangs? It looks that way, Harris said. And it gets worse. Miller's name showed up in some of the same circles. I think they've both been covering for certain people, turning a blind eye to drug trafficking, maybe even planting evidence to keep their partners safe. Grace sank into her chair, the weight of the revelation hitting her like a freight train. This is bigger than I thought, she murmured. If this is true, it's not just about misconduct. It's about corruption, deep, systemic corruption. Harris nodded. And if Reed and Miller are involved, who else is? This could go all the way up the chain. Grace closed the file, her mind already formulating a plan. We need proof, she said. Solid proof. Something that ties them directly to the corruption. If we're going to expose this, we have to do it the right way. No shortcuts. Harris hesitated. That's not going to be easy, Chief. You know they'll cover their tracks. Grace looked up at him, determination burning in her eyes. Then we'll uncover them. Start digging, quietly. I want to know who else is involved, and I want to know how deep this goes. But we keep this between us for now. If word gets out, they'll bury everything. Harris nodded, his respect for her growing with every passing moment. Understood. As he left the room, Grace leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of her responsibility pressed down on her, but she refused to let it crush her. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let corruption and complacency define her department. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She straightened as Captain Ramirez stepped in, his expression unreadable. "Chief," he said, his voice careful, "you've got visitors." "Who?" Grace asked, frowning. Ramirez stepped aside, revealing two sharply dressed men in dark suits. "FBI agents." "Chief Johnson," one of them said, extending a hand. "Agent Daniels. This is Agent Carter. We'd like to speak with you about an ongoing investigation." Grace's brow furrowed as she shook his hand. "What investigation?" Daniels exchanged a glance with Carter before answering. "We've been looking into corruption within your department. Specifically, officers colluding with criminal organizations. We believe Reed and Miller are part of a larger network." Grace's heart raced, though her expression remained calm. "And what exactly do you need from me?" "We need your cooperation," Carter said. "Access to internal records, personnel files, body cam footage, anything that could help us build our case. And we need to know that you're willing to stand with us, even if it means going up against your own people." Grace didn't hesitate. "You have my full cooperation," she said firmly. "But I need something from you in return." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "I need this to be done transparently," Grace said. "When this comes out, and it will come out, I want the community to see that we're taking this seriously. That we're not just sweeping it under the rug. If we're going to rebuild trust, we have to be honest about what we're doing and why." Daniels nodded, impressed by her resolve. "Agreed." As the agents left, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy. She would face backlash from within the department, resistance from the union, and scrutiny from the public. But if this investigation could expose the rot at the heart of her department, it would all be worth it. Later that evening, as Grace prepared to leave the station, she received another text from the unknown number. "Back off, or you'll regret it." Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay calm. She'd expected threats, it was part of the job. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this one was different. She looked around the empty station, her hand instinctively moving to her badge. "Let them try," she muttered under her breath, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every officer who believed in justice, every resident who deserved better, and every step toward dismantling a broken system. Grace Johnson wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The rain had returned, a steady drizzle coating the city as Grace stepped out of her car in front of a nondescript diner. The glow of the neon open sign flickered in the window, casting a faint red hue onto the wet pavement. She adjusted the collar of her coat and walked inside, her eyes scanning the nearly empty room. A lone figure sat in the corner booth, his head low and a steaming mug of coffee in front of him. "Lieutenant Harris," Grace said as she approached, her tone quiet but firm. Harris looked up, his face lined with exhaustion. "Chief," he greeted, sliding a folder across the table toward her. Grace slid into the booth, her eyes narrowing as she opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of bank statements, emails, and surveillance photos. It was damning evidence: money transfers, meetings with known gang members, and even an envelope of cash being handed off to Reed in an alleyway. "This is everything?" Grace asked, her voice low. Harris nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "It's enough to nail Reed and Miller. But it goes deeper than just the two of them. I found references to other officers, too. Names I didn't expect." Grace's brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages. "What kind of names?" Harris hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Ramirez." The name hit Grace like a punch to the gut. Captain Ramirez, her second-in-command, the man who had stood beside her since she'd taken the role of chief, was implicated. She closed the folder and leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Harris nodded solemnly. "The payments trace back to him. He's been shielding Reed and Miller for years, covering their tracks and making sure complaints against them never went anywhere. And he's been profiting from it." Grace exhaled slowly, her fingers drumming against the edge of the folder. "This explains why Ramirez has been so quiet since the incident. I thought he was just trying to avoid taking sides, but he's been protecting himself." "Exactly," Harris said. "And if Ramirez is involved, who knows how many others are, too. We're looking at a web of corruption that could tear this department apart." Grace's jaw tightened. "Good," she said firmly. Harris blinked in surprise. "Good." "Yes," Grace replied. "If tearing this department apart is what it takes to rebuild it the right way, then so be it. I'm not here to protect the status quo, Harris. I'm here to fix it." Harris leaned back, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're a braver woman than I am, Chief." Grace chuckled dryly. "Bravery has nothing to do with it. I'm just too damn stubborn to let them win." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them. Finally, Harris spoke again. "What's the next move?" Grace tapped her fingers against the folder, her mind already working through the possibilities. "I'll meet with the FBI tomorrow and hand this over. But I want to handle Ramirez myself. He's been a part of this department for over 20 years. If he's going down, it's going to be on my terms." Harris nodded. "And the others? Reed and Miller?" "They'll be dealt with through the investigation," Grace said. "But Ramirez, he's the key. If we take him out of the equation, the rest of the network will crumble." Harris frowned. "You think he'll cooperate?" Grace's eyes hardened. "He doesn't have a choice." The following morning, Grace walked into the precinct with purpose. Her steps echoed through the corridor as officers paused to watch her pass. The tension was palpable. News of Reed and Miller's suspension had spread like wildfire, and speculation about the investigation was on everyone's lips. Grace pushed open the door to Ramirez's office without knocking. He looked up from his desk, startled. "Chief," he said, quickly standing. "Is everything all right?" "Sit down, Ramirez," Grace said curtly, closing the door behind her. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he obeyed, sinking back into his chair. "What's this about?" Grace placed the folder on his desk and opened it, turning it toward him. "Care to explain this?" Ramirez's eyes flicked to the documents, and for a split second, Grace saw panic flash across his face. He quickly masked it with feigned confusion. "I don't know what this is," he said. "Don't lie to me," Grace snapped, her voice sharp. "The payments, the meetings, the cover-ups, I know everything, Ramirez. You've been working with Reed and Miller to protect their racket, and you've been profiting from it." Ramirez leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "This is a serious accusation, Chief. You'd better have proof." Grace slammed her hand on the desk, making him flinch. "Don't test me," she said coldly. "I have more than enough to bury you. The FBI is already involved, and when this breaks, you'll be lucky if you don't end up in prison." Ramirez's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You don't know what you're getting into, Grace. This isn't just about me or Reed or Miller. There are people above us, people who won't let this go quietly. "Let them come," Grace said, her voice steady. "I'm not afraid of them, and I'm not afraid of you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Finally, Ramirez exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone resigned. "I want the truth," Grace said. "All of it. Every name, every deal, every dirty cop in this department. You give me that, and I might be willing to work out a deal with the FBI. But if you hold back, I'll make sure you go down with the rest of them." Ramirez stared at her, his face a mixture of anger and defeat. "You don't understand how deep this goes," he said quietly. "Then make me understand," Grace replied. "Because one way or another, this ends today." By the time Grace left Ramirez's office, the folder in her hand had grown thicker. She had spent hours extracting every detail she could, pressing him until he finally broke. The list of names he provided was longer than she had expected, and the scope of the corruption was staggering. She walked into her office and dialed Agent Daniels. "It's done," she said when he answered. "I have everything you need." "Good," Daniels replied. "We'll send a team to the station this afternoon. Be ready." Grace hung up and sat back in her chair, staring at the list of names in front of her. She knew this was only the beginning. The arrests, the backlash, the rebuilding, it would be a long, uphill battle. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. She glanced at the text she had received the night before, still saved on her phone. "Back off, or you'll regret it." Grace smiled grimly, her resolve unwavering. "Not a chance," she muttered. The fight wasn't over, but Grace Johnson had no intention of backing down. Not now. Not ever. The precinct was in chaos. The arrival of FBI agents that afternoon had sent shockwaves through the department, with officers scrambling to piece together what was happening. Grace stood in the center of it all, her arms crossed and her expression unflinching as she watched agents cart off boxes of evidence, escorted by Ramirez's detailed confessions. She'd stayed in his office until she'd squeezed every ounce of information out of him: names, dates, payments. It had all been laid bare, and now the consequences were unfolding in real time. Ramirez had been quietly taken into custody an hour ago, escorted out a side door to avoid the prying eyes of the media. Reed and Miller weren't so lucky. Their arrests were deliberate and public, meant to send a message. Cameras flashed as the two men were walked out of the station in handcuffs, their faces pale and grim. Grace watched from her office window as reporters shouted questions and microphones were thrust into their faces. "Chief Johnson," one of the reporters called, spotting her through the glass. "Is this the start of a complete reform in the department?" Grace's jaw tightened. Reform was the goal, but the road to it was anything but clear. She stepped back from the window, letting the blinds fall into place. Harris stood behind her, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "That's the third camera crew this afternoon," Harris said, crossing his arms. "You're the story of the week." Grace turned to him, shaking her head. "It's not about me, Harris. It's about the department and the community. People are angry, and they have every right to be." She gestured toward the window. "What they saw last night, the arrests, that's just the beginning. If we don't follow through, if we don't deliver real change, it'll all mean nothing." Harris nodded. "And if anyone can pull it off, it's you, Chief." "Let's hope so," Grace replied, sitting down at her desk. Over the next few weeks, the department underwent a transformation that felt seismic. Grace held a press conference the day after Ramirez's confession, standing alone at the podium as she addressed the public. "I'm not here to defend the actions of this department," she'd said, her voice steady despite the flashes of cameras. "I'm here to acknowledge its failures, and to promise you that those failures will not go unaddressed." She'd laid out a detailed plan for reform, which included mandatory bias training, stricter oversight of complaints against officers, and the establishment of an independent review board made up of community members. It was ambitious, and the pushback was immediate. The police union filed grievances, some officers resigned, and conservative pundits blasted her as being anti-police. Grace ignored them all. But it wasn't just the outside pressure she had to contend with. Inside the department, the mood was tense. Whispers of resentment followed her everywhere she went, and though some officers supported her, others made it clear they didn't trust her. One afternoon, as Grace walked through the precinct, she overheard two younger officers murmuring near the coffee machine. "She's gonna ruin this place," one of them said. "Throwing us under the bus just to make herself look good." Grace stopped in her tracks. She turned to them, her gaze sharp. "You think I'm ruining this place?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The younger officer looked startled. Chief, we didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Grace interrupted. She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "And you're right. I am ruining this place. I'm ruining the culture that lets bad cops get away with abusing their power. I'm ruining the system that protects people like Reed and Miller instead of protecting the community. So if that's the place you're mourning, then you're damn right. I'm ruining it." The officer swallowed hard, nodding mutely as Grace walked away. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the department began to shift. The independent review board became a reality, and complaints were no longer swept under the rug. Grace personally met with community leaders every month, listening to their concerns and implementing changes based on their feedback. But not everything went smoothly. The arrests of Ramirez, Reed, and Miller had sparked a chain reaction, with other officers implicated in the corruption network coming under scrutiny. Some cooperated, striking deals with the FBI to reduce their sentences. Others fought back, their cases dragging out in court. The media frenzy continued, and Grace found herself under constant scrutiny. One night, as she sat alone in her office, her phone buzzed with a text. "You've gone too far this time." Grace stared at the message, her stomach knotting. She'd been receiving anonymous threats since the day she started cleaning house, but this one felt different. It was short, direct, and carried a sense of finality that made her uneasy. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The station was empty except for a skeleton crew, and the silence was unsettling. For the first time in months, Grace allowed herself to feel the weight of what she was doing. The fight had been worth it, but it had come at a cost: her peace of mind, her safety, and the trust of many within her own ranks. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were counting on her to succeed. And no matter how tired she was, she wouldn't let them down. 6 months after the arrests, Grace stood in front of the department's new graduating class of recruits. The group was smaller than in previous years, but it was diverse, and each recruit had been rigorously vetted to ensure they embodied the values Grace wanted the department to uphold. "You are the future of this department," Grace told them, her voice strong and clear. "You have a responsibility, not just to enforce the law, but to protect and serve with integrity, compassion, and respect. The badge you wear doesn't make you untouchable. It makes you accountable. Never forget that." The recruits nodded, their faces solemn. Grace felt a flicker of hope as she looked at them. Change was slow, but it was happening. 1 year after the night Reed and Miller had assaulted her, Grace walked through the same neighborhood where it had happened. This time, she wasn't alone. Harris walked beside her, along with a small group of officers who had volunteered to join her for a community event. Residents watched curiously as the officers handed out food, played with kids, and talked with local leaders. Grace knelt beside a little girl drawing chalk hearts on the sidewalk, her badge glinting in the sunlight. "Are you a real police officer?" the girl asked, looking up at her with wide eyes. "I am," Grace said with a smile. "Do you arrest bad guys?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "I do. But my job isn't just to arrest people. It's to help people too." The girl grinned, her teeth missing in the front. "That's cool." Grace laughed softly, her heart lighter than it had been in months. As she stood, Harris approached her, nodding toward the crowd. "Looks like they're starting to trust us again," he said. Grace followed his gaze, seeing smiles and handshakes where there had once been suspicion and anger. "It's a start," she replied. Harris smiled. "It's more than that, Chief. It's progress." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Grace allowed herself to believe he was right.